Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Operations Cabinet. In today's episode, we will be discussing Elliot Clark's undergraduate history dissertation, The Shadowed Advisor, the role of Clementine Churchill. So then, Elliot, would you like to provide us with an overview of your undergraduate thesis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. So the main aim behind this dissertation was to really establish the role that Clementine played not only in aiding but facilitating Winston Churchill's political career. I wanted to look at not only this, but the implications this had on their marriage. We see throughout their marriage that Clementine plays a really pivotal role in supporting and aiding Winston's work. But how did this impact her personally? How did this heavy burden that lay on Winston's shoulders also lay on hers? So with these first two chapters, I really wanted to focus on those political years. And with that first chapter, I wanted to look at those early years and how we see Clementine's character growing. We see her find her own voice. In 1915, when Churchill was removed as First Lord of the Admiralty, we see a really passionate letter from Clementine to the Prime Minister, Asquith, at the time. And she tells him how he'd be committing an act of weakness and wasting a valuable war material. And this is Clementine first putting her political stamp in the sphere. And this is really significant later on in life because she's learning these tools which she would need when Churchill becomes Prime Minister. And in the second chapter, I went on to those later years to understand how she supported Churchill on those Blitz tours and supporting his work, but also her own war work, because this is something which isn't always talked about. In 1941, Clementine was made the chair of the Aid to Russia Fund. And here we see probably her most significant aspect of her work throughout all of Churchill's career. It's with this fund we see Clementine's character really show through. She's gaining more and more public support, and she's getting more recognition in the media as well. As a result of the money she raised for medical supplies and clothing for Russia, she was invited on tour. It's on this tour that Churchill claimed that Clementine was the one bright star in Anglo-Russian relations. This is because she was able to show Churchill's desire for a continued friendship with Russia. So this isn't just a tour about the clothing, the medical supplies that the fund was able to provide. This was more of creating alliances for the future. And this was crucial. This showed Clementine was not only a charity organizer, but a diplomat. And this was crucial. With that third chapter going through, I start to look at the personal lives, but more importantly, the tragedies which the Churchills faced. I look at the death of Marigold, with the 2-year-old daughter of the Churchills, and the impact this had. It's had such an emotional impact. And we see at this time, both Clementine and Churchill suffering from depression. And as it goes through this chapter, it looks more at the ways that Churchill and Clementine didn't agree on every political matter. With the abdication crisis, we see that Clementine tells Churchill not to support the king, but Churchill, the royalist he is, he of course supports his king. And Churchill's booed in the House of Commons when he makes a speech. And it's at this point, Clementine really discusses the idea of divorce. And obviously this would have been catastrophic because in 1940, when Churchill was made Prime Minister, he needs Clementine then more than ever before. So a few years before, where Clementine's considering divorce, this could have changed the future for British history. But it's here that Clementine talks to her sister-in-law about this idea of divorce, and her sister-in-law explains to her that she just needs time away. And this was crucial. Clementine went away on holiday and came back and realized that the burden was sort of disappearing once she had time to herself. And it's here we see that the Churchills quite often begin to have separate holidays. And this is really significant. That final chapter in chapter 4, I look at the legacy which Churchill left behind, but more importantly, how Clementine herself, once Churchill had passed away in 1965, how she looked to preserve it, but how also her life changed as she moved back into London and she continued her life. But throughout her life, she still was always concerned about Churchill and upholding his legacy and his stance in the political sphere.
Well, thank you, Elliot. That was a fascinating overview of your thesis. Could you provide us with a bit more detail about the types of sources you were using in your arguments?
Yeah, of course. So with my research, obviously being Churchill, a lot of my work is done at the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge. And I was lucky enough with this that I had the support of the Jenny Churchill Fund, which facilitated a large amount of my research. So while I was there, the key focus of my research was looking at the communication, the letters, the telegrams between both Winston and Clementine. And of course, there is an awful lot of letters between the two, so you are searching through them for hours on end. But luckily, the publication we've got now is speaking for themselves, which Mary Soames, the daughter of the Churchills, wrote. So once leaving the archives, you can go back and refer to that to look at some of those letters in more detail. But not only these letters, I wanted to look at the newspapers' reports on Clementine. How was Clementine being represented in the media? How was she growing through these years to gain more influence, gain more stance as a political figure herself? And I thought that was really important to understanding how her role changed, not only in aiding, facilitating Churchill's career, but aiding her own career going through. As well as this, I was looking at newspapers, not only at the Churchill Archive Centre, but on the Times Digital Archives and Trove Archives, British Newspaper Archives. And I think these newspapers are really significant to understanding public perception of Clementine and Churchill as we see them as a pair and separately being represented in the media.
Well, thank you, Elliot, for that overview of sources. It sounds like you used certainly a lot, especially when going to Cambridge. So did you actually have any difficulty in obtaining material and sources at all, especially during the later stages of your research and the write-up process as we entered the global pandemic?
Yeah, there were definitely difficulties there, but I was quite lucky that I was able to go to Cambridge in February 2020, so just before the pandemic started, really. So I got the majority of the sources I needed at that stage, and I spent 2 or 3 days there going through the material. But once I was in that write-up stages, if there was anything else I sort of realised I could do with that source, it became quite hard then to get access to stuff. So I was having to really rely on those digital archives, especially the newspaper archives coming through. But luckily enough, I had that large amount of sources there. But then the issue which came through there was the limited word count. You've got all these sources, and how do you narrow those down? So I was really having to specify on specific sources which would really enhance my argument and leave those other sources out. But at the same time, this is quite beneficial, especially for Alex and I now when we're looking at that postgraduate study. We've got those sources there we could possibly use in our current studies, or they could form articles coming up later on. So that's really vital for us then. But at the time, it seemed like quite a difficult situation to find yourself in when you have all these sources. But luckily now you can actually see the beneficial aspects behind this.
No, that's a very good point about sources, and it's certainly something I felt within my own work. So while using these sources then, would you say that they primarily drove the methodology, or how did the methodology exactly structure your thesis?
Yeah, so with the sources I had, I was really looking at, obviously it's all very archival based. When you come and you're studying a political figure, it's obviously going to be very biographical. But I didn't want to follow that normal cradle to grave study. I wanted to create a new aspect of political biography. So what I did with this is with those first 2 chapters, it was very political based. It's the early years and then Churchill's premiership. But then it jumps back and it looks at those private years in the 1920s, which I would call the personal wilderness years. The 30s are the Churchill's wilderness years politically, but those really early years in the 20s, I would say, are the personal wilderness years. They have tragedy after tragedy coming through with family deaths, and it really impacted both of them. So that jump between periods, it's not a normal biographical aspect. I was trying to create this probably new era of biographical study at this stage. And I thought that was really important for this study. And thankfully it worked. That's the key thing behind it. I was concerned while writing it that maybe this isn't the best route to take, but it did work. And I think breaking it down into those different sections of personal and political life really helped actually the structure and the method behind this dissertation.
Well, it sounds like a very impressive work, and it's obviously one of the largest pieces of work you've written to this date. So because of that, did you learn anything about your own writing style when creating this thesis?
Yeah, definitely. I think the key thing I learnt was over-researching. Probably when you're in the archives, is to really focus down on the sources you're going to need for this dissertation. Obviously, when we go to the archives, we're probably, for an undergraduate as well, you're quite overwhelmed by the amount of documents which are available to you, and you just want to read absolutely everything. But I think one thing I learned, not from the write-up stage, but for the research stage specifically, was to go in with an aim and a list of the sources you want to look at, because otherwise you're going to go in and you will want to have a look at everything. But with the learning on the writing skills behind that, it was learning that new sort of aspect of my research in terms of this new era of political biography. I thought that was really important, and that really has changed my writing style. Now I've used that in essays and articles that I'm working on at the minute to really structure the way in which I'm working now. And I think that was probably very vital. But more than anything as well, I learned more about political figures and their lives. as a historian in the field that I'm in, I think that's really important to learn at this stage, because when you're sort of producing work in years to come, you're going to have to know how to structure that.
Well, thank you, Elliot. And I totally have to agree with your last points there about over-researching. I certainly found that with my own work. Speaking of the amount of sources that you kind of had available to you, this is obviously a very large field of study. What inspired you to examine Clementine Churchill in particular? And how do you think this made your thesis stand out in what is such a crowded field, the study of the Churchill family and dynasty?
This is such a vast field, and this is where the issue lies. We have nearly 2,000 books on the life of Winston Churchill. There are far less on Clementine, but those that really stand out in this field are Sonia Purnell's The First Lady and Jack Fishman, My Darling Clementine, and these were really influential for my own work. With this, I really wanted to focus on the political abilities which Clementine was having, which we see in both these studies, but what I wanted to show more is the implications these commitments were having on the marriage of Winston and Clementine Churchill. This isn't something that's looked in mass detail before, so I thought this was really vital to understanding, because we always talk about the burden on Churchill's shoulders, but that burden was just as much on Clementine's. I think that's vital to understanding it. As well as these studies by both Purnell and Fishman, one of the key things which influenced me was I went to Chartwell Manor, the home of the Churchills, and while walking through at the time, there was an exhibition on Clementine Churchill. And you see the different aspects of the house, and you see the work of Clementine within this exhibition. And it was from this point I then read Purnell's book, and I really started to question the role Clementine was playing, the life she led, and how we see her not only as a mother, but the carer of Churchill, and she upholds this career. And I wanted to understand this in more detail. So this was really influential, and Chartwell has some excellent exhibitions I'd really recommend going. And yeah, this exhibition was really key to influencing my own study.
Well, it sounds like you certainly learnt a lot about the field and how Clementine impacted on Churchill's life. So obviously you're still studying the Churchills and the Churchill dynasty with your current postgraduate research. So how would you say that your undergraduate thesis influenced the current research and work that you're conducting?
Like I was saying, we have these studies of the great man being Churchill, and looking at Clementine, you see another aspect of Churchill's life. And I do think that if we don't understand the life of Clementine Churchill, there's a real gap in the understanding of Churchill himself. So I started to question the lives of the other figures around Churchill this time, not only his family, but his cabinet around him. And it was this I wanted to understand in more detail, those in the shadows behind Churchill and the ways they worked to uphold his career, to not only impact him politically, but personally at home, how they had the conversations with him, which would inspire him when he was writing speeches and would help him in times of real low and times of depression. And I think those figures we don't understand the lives of. And I think to understanding Churchill's life, we really have to understand their lives as well.
Well, thank you very much, Elliot, for your time today. It was wonderful to learn a bit more about your undergraduate dissertation, so thank you for going through it. You mentioned a little while ago that you had some other upcoming projects. I believe you're giving a talk on the Churchills and their visit to Plymouth. Would you like to give us a bit more details about that?
Yeah, so this talk will be happening on April 21st, which is next week now, on Wednesday, I believe. This talk is going to be looking at both Churchills visiting Plymouth. And we see that this tour wasn't just to boost the morale of Plymouth, but across the nation during this time. I'll be looking at the impact both Churchill and Clementine had on the media and the role they played during these years in going out to see the people, understanding their mood and being able to connect with them.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talk. We'll be sharing some details about that on our social media over the coming week or so. So look out for that. We hope to see or hear that some of our listeners have joined us for that. In terms of the Operations Cabinet schedule next, we're going to be posting Elliot's talk as an on-demand video, hopefully the day after, so that will be the Thursday the 22nd, I believe. And then after that, we're going to be having a short break, and we'll be back in May with some more content, as we have a few assignments we have to deal with first. But thank you very much for listening today. We greatly appreciate it. If you have any comments, feel free to drop them down in the comments section down below. You can also find links to our social media and our email address in the description. If you have any questions about what you've heard today or about Elliot's upcoming talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching.